Although you may get the impression from the use of the word Pima that the Pima people are distinct from a lot of the other Native American tribes in the region, there's a lot of interconnectedness. Really, they're very close to the Tono O'odham people, or the O'odham tribe as a whole. And the O'odham people are actually tied by where they were geographically. The Tono O'odham, or the Desert O'odham, the Akimel O'odham, or the River O'odham, and Ira Hayes and his family were from the River O'odham people, or the Akimel O'odham. In reality, they're called the Pima Indians because they were a group of people who, when the Spanish came, they would say Pimac, which in their language meant I don't know, because the Spanish were asking them a lot of questions relating to who owns this land, and they didn't understand the concept of land ownership at the time. And Ira Hayes' father was born in 1901 in this county. And in 1922, he married his wife, who's buried just over here. And this is a large cemetery on the Gila River community, just south of the town of, I believe, well, Tucson's up to the north, and then you have Phoenix south of it, and just south of Phoenix you have this city of Gila. And there's a large number of military graves in the cemetery, and I aim to tell a little bit of the story of the Pima and the Gila River Indian community here. Next to me now is the grave of Nancy Hayes, or the mother of Ira Hayes, and the wife of Joe Hayes, who lies just over there, right between another one of their sons who also served in the military. And Nancy Hayes was a member of the Pima Nation. Now, the Pima Nation is very similar to the Tono O'odham Nation, but itself is divided into two separate nations which are very close to this valley. She was a member of the Gila River Indian community, and it was in this community that 2 years after she married Joe Hayes, she experienced what is now considered by some members of this tribe to be a genocide. The federal government came in and tried an irrigation project whereby they would irrigate 50,000 acres of Native American land and 50,000 acres of white settler land. Well, this amounted to a very slow project which resulted in a famine, killing many, many, many Pima. And it was from her and from her husband that a very active military community sprung up. Their first son, Ira Hayes, raised the flag on Iwo Jima in World War II, and he even said later that he felt like a little man by the U.S. Army. And it was impressive that he spent so much time, and his family, especially his mother, was very supportive of the U.S., even though she experienced basically a genocide at their hands, at economic and infrastructure mismanagement. And they weren't even allowed to vote until several years after her son made it back from World War II. The voting right to the Pima was not actually created until 1948, and she lived until 1972. And eventually Ira Hayes was buried in Arlington, but his family still resides in this cemetery. And they're not often visited by people who are military history enthusiasts, but I think it's very important to remember where they came from. And they came from this desolate community which is often overlooked. And the Tono O'odham people, to which they're closely tied, are also very well descended in Mexico, and the Mexican government overlooks them as well. And if you look at the Tono O'odham reservation, it borders the Mexican state. It borders Sonora in the Mexican country. And this is cut in half. It cuts their people in two. And that's why every time the federal government says they want to build a wall between Mexico and America, the Tono O'odham Nation says absolutely not. And the Tono O'odham is tied to the Pima. And the Pima and Tono O'odham both believe they share a common descendant in the Hohokam. And the Hohokam is a Pima word meaning those who have vanished. And we should not allow the Pima to become the Hohokam. Next to me now is another interesting grave buried between his mother, Nancy Hayes, and his father, Joe Hayes. He was the brother of Ira Hayes, and his name is Leonard Hayes. He served in World War II alongside his brother, well, not alongside in the same unit, but in World War II, and he was active in the 12th Cavalry. but it was in 1962 that he died in a car crash. And unlike his brother Ira Hayes, he was not buried at Arlington. Instead, he was buried out here in a mostly long-forgotten section of what is now America. We like to forget about the Native American people who contributed to our military, but just a simple look around would show all of these military tombstones, all of these people who went off to fight for us and then came back here to be pretty much forgotten. And like I said with his mother, the people that came before them are now called those who were forgotten, or those who came before us. And we should never allow this to happen again, because even today there's talk of dissolving tribes and merging them for ease of paperwork. And I think that it's important to remember and to point out the history of the people who tried their best to help us, in spite of the fact that they couldn't vote until 1948. As an interesting expression of the close ties that these Gila people share with the Tohono O'odham, you have here the man in the maze, which is a religious symbol depicting somebody entering the underworld underneath Babakeevery Peak. This is sort of their creator deity, or at least traditionally was. Ironically, all throughout World War II, the hometown of Ira Hayes was also home to a Japanese-American internment camp. This was known as the Gila River Internment Camp, and construction on this place began on May Day, 1942. And it was only discontinued very late September and November because there were two separate camp systems of 1945. Now, when this plan was pitched to the local community, the Gila River Native American community and the tribal government strongly rejected to it, because the sheer number of Japanese people here would make it the fourth largest city in Arizona. It was a logistical nightmare for the tribe, to say the very least. But because they couldn't even vote until 1948, that wasn't really their decision. So the plans for construction went forward, and it later was known, interestingly, as one of the least restrictive camps in all of the Japanese internment systems. Yes, Japanese and Japanese Americans were interned here, but it was one of the very few camps without any barbed wire. And nowadays, there apparently is a memorial somewhere over the river, and I think I see it right now, but it's very difficult to reach because there's no public roads which make it over there. And there's very few structures which remain, and most were torn down, and it's actually said that the site itself is mostly holy land to the Tohono O'odham and to the Pima people. So out of respect, I'm not going to cross this drainage canal, but I will show the remains of the Japanese American structures left and what stands. When I first decided to visit the Gila River community, I wanted to learn more about people who were active and born here. And this began with Ira Hayes, but it quickly branched out when I discovered the Matthew B. Wan Ira Hayes Memorial Park, and it made me question, who was Matthew B. Wan? Matthew Wan was another Pima man who was born in this community and enlisted with the Selective Service in 1917. By 1918, he boarded the SS Tuscania en route to France. This boat would never make it there. It was torpedoed, and nearly the entire crew was killed, 200 men along with 65 civilian staff. He washed up alive miraculously to the coast of Ireland and was eventually sent over to England, where his unit was, and then to France. And he died on the first charge against German-occupied territory within France. He was buried up until 1921 in France, until he was repatriated, brought back here, and buried with some very good distinction in the church behind me. A lot of important officials are buried here, and as opposed to the other cemetery with the parents of Ira Hayes. But this church, very sadly, burned down in 2019. And they don't know what caused it yet, but they think it might be arson. But this was the Pentecostal church, and it was named after C.H. Cook Memorial. And this was a local military man that was active many, many years ago here, who was not a Pima, but he's buried with good distinction right alongside all the rest. He was the first Arizona man to die in World War I, and obviously the first Native American in Arizona to die in the Great War.